Hello, this is the podcast from the international research platform SIMM, with reports and interviews from across the world on the role music can play in social and community programs. I am Lucas Perron. I'm joined by Jeff Baker, who is Professor of Music at Royal Holloway, University of London, and he's also founding board member of SIMM. Hi, Jeff.
Hi, Lucas.
So, next week you're going to give a keynote speech on the 12th of January at the beginning of the symposium this year online. And so I don't want you to tell us what you're going to tell us all during your keynote speech, of course. But I see that the title of the keynote, Rethinking Social Action Through Music, is also the title of a new book which is coming out on your research in Medellin in Colombia. Can you tell a little bit about your recent work over there?
Yes, sure. So that's right. I've been interested in the city of Medellin in Colombia since 2012, when I first visited the city briefly. And on that visit, I went to a music education program called the Red de Escuelas de Música de Medellín, or the Network of Music Schools of Medellín. And it caught my attention, along with a lot of other cultural programs in the city. But this sort of sowed the seed of an idea, a desire to go back and to learn more. And eventually, 4 years later, in 2016, I was able to go back for a couple of weeks with an idea in my mind of a research project. And I went to go and talk to the director of the network at that time and see if there were possibilities for doing this research. And she was very welcoming, very open to the idea. So I then applied for a grant, which I was lucky enough to receive. And so in 2017, I went back with my family for a year and spent a year doing fieldwork with this program. And so that finished in 2018, and over the last year or so, I've been writing up this fieldwork as a book, which is, as you say, entitled Rethinking Social Action Through Music, and it has a subtitle, which is The Search for Coexistence and Citizenship in Medellin's Music Schools.
Most of us, I think, found out about your research work when we discovered the Oxford University book on your research on Sistema Venezuela. How are things going over there now with all the immense problems that the country is going through? Are you in contact with Sistema Venezuela, and how is it? Is it still developing, or how is it developing then?
I think the answer is it's a little hard for me to know, because I did my fieldwork in Venezuela 10 years ago now. And almost all the people that I met, that I interviewed, that I conversed with at length have left. So my contacts really don't help me very much get a close sense of what's going on in Venezuela. Of course, I hear things, and Venezuela's been assailed by multiple crises at the same time. So, COVID has just been the latest in a line of crises, really, for Venezuela, going back a number of years. So the program still exists. It's still hanging on. It's clearly diminished compared with its heyday around the time that I was researching it. But it's always very hard to get a sense of El Sistema from outside. This has always been the case. This is why people misread it so badly a decade or a dozen years ago, because one thing is the message, the image that it projects to the outside world, and something very different is what's actually going on within the program. So, I think that it's very hard for somebody who's not there on the ground to really answer that question. But clearly the program is significantly diminished compared with where it was a decade ago, but just because so many people have left.
Do you have the impression also that there's more and more interest from practitioners in research, in being involved themselves in research, or in following up on the research which is done on the practice?
Yes, I mean, I think in terms of interest, obviously the SIMM field is huge. It has many different branches, and I think it's very difficult, almost impossible for any one of us to either have an overview of everything or indeed to make any statement that is true for the entire field. So, I have my perspective, I have the programs that I know well, and I would say that there is plenty of interest. It's not universal, but certainly in the recent work I've been doing in Colombia, there was a lot of interest from the program that I was researching with, because they had their own researchers embedded within the program. And this was a very interesting development, because it meant that when I arrived to begin my research, I was able to collaborate really from the first day with local researchers who had very similar kinds of questions. So that was a very positive sign, and it meant that the research flowed in very productive, very interesting ways. Sometimes excessive rhetoric that surrounds this field. I mean, it's very, very dependent on which branch, which area you're looking at. It's certainly something that's a feature of some areas of the field, but in some ways I think it's very unsurprising. I mean, in a sense, we're bombarded with positive messages about music for various reasons. There've been there's a positive tradition of thinking about the effects of music that goes right back to the ancient Greeks, and it's become very dominant in recent decades as it's become more important to justify cultural funding by providing economic and social justifications. So, this kind of these positive messages have really become very, very prominent in recent times. So, I think it's pretty natural that some of the rhetoric around this field is quite optimistic, let's say.
Is there anything that you really want to share within this SIMM-podcast on future research which should be done, which should be developed further?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think that the way I see the field having developed in recent years is in many ways very positive. I mean, I think that certainly compared with 10 years ago when I was setting out to Venezuela, there is so much more research published in this area of SIMM work, of music as social action. And I look at landmark books like the Oxford Handbook of Social Justice in Music Education or the Oxford Handbook of Community Music. These are fabulous resources that didn't exist when I was doing my research on Venezuela. It didn't exist when I published my book on El Sistema. So there is a lot more nuanced, critical discussion in these kinds of works and many others, getting into the complexities of trying to impact on society through music education, through music making. And my recent experiences in Colombia equally have been very positive in terms of seeing changes in practice, changes in thinking. So I think there's a lot of good movement really, and where I see a need for more work is not necessarily in particular topics that I think need to be researched. I'm sure there are, and I'm sure other people would have excellent ideas for what those should be. I think for me personally, the priorities would be around, as I said, research and practice, really, this connection and thinking more deeply about where research and practice do connect, where they don't connect, where there's sometimes blockages, and what could be done about those, because I think that certainly bringing practitioners and researchers together is an important step, but I also think that there's more to it than that. Sometimes blockages arise that aren't just about the flow of information. There are deeper, more structural issues there, and I think some serious attention, one might almost say some research on the connection between practice and research in this field would be a really valuable thing to do. Having people involved who do both is really crucial, because I think that one of the best ways of overcoming perceptions of a division between these two fields is precisely to look at individuals who overcome that, or have thought through those questions in their own work, who embody this kind of connection. And the work that we're doing in Agrigento, the charity that I work for, we very much look for these kinds of figures, because we think that that they can somehow symbolize, but also enact these kinds of connections that are so important. But I also think that it's worth thinking both in advance and during about this question of the connection between research and practice, as it were, as a conceptual issue. In other words, that it's not just a question of getting two sides. I'm reluctant to use that word because I don't think they are two sides, but let's say, for the sake of simplicity, two sides to be in the same room or to speak to each other. I think there are deeper issues there, and that are not unique to music, that are not unique to SIMM. I think, if one were to go into it, one would find that this issue of research practice connection or a research practice divide is found in many fields of human activity. And I think there's a lot we could learn from actually studying how people in other fields, very different fields, it could be health, it could be computing, it could be all sorts of areas, how people have actually addressed this on a more meta level, on a more conceptual level, in order to kind of push forward on two levels at once. The level of yes, bringing people together, talking to each other, listening to each other, fabulous, but also this kind of conceptual step as well.
Jeff Baker, thank you so much for being with us in this podcast, and looking forward to see you soon, and especially on the 12th of January to hear your keynote speech for the symposium.
Well, thanks very much, Lucas. Thank you for the invitation today, and of course for the invitation for the symposium, for the presentation at the symposium, which I'm very much looking forward to. So, thank you.
John Swoboda is somebody who has different careers, and he has a long career behind him doing research in the psychology of music making, but also listening to music, appreciating music. And since a few years, John is with us on the SIMM platform, and he's our first president of the SIMM platform. Hello, John. Good morning.
Good morning, Lucas. Nice to talk to you.
John, I would like to speak with you today about different sessions in the upcoming symposium. Of course, there's the first session with keynote speech of Jeff Baker, which you will welcome, and also you will discuss with him, and afterwards also answer the Q&A, which comes from people attending the symposium. We don't know what the keynote speech will be about, and we're curious to hear it next week on the 12th of January. Can you tell something about what you know of Jeff's work, what you think we might expect from this keynote speech?
So, as I think everyone knows, Jeff 5 years ago published a really foundational, a seminal book on the El Sistema project in Venezuela, in a sense looking under the bonnet and testing in a very rigorous way some of the more public claims that the El Sistema organization has made, and really testing those claims against the reality on the ground, speaking to the musicians, some of the families involved, to get a much more in-depth picture of what's going on there, and drawing some implications for what works in SIMM projects and what doesn't. His keynote speech to this current conference is going to be on his recently completed project on a similar large-scale orchestral project in Colombia called The Red. And he has been doing intensive work there in Colombia for a number of years prior to this. And he is going to be publishing a new book, on his Columbia one. And Jeff has told me that his presentation will basically be to outline the research that he's done in Colombia and give us some of the headline findings, what he learnt, and both also similarities but also big contrasts between the El Sistema project and the project in Colombia, which in some ways has been a much more open project in the sense of the managers, the organizers, and the founders have been having very, very public debates about what this project is, what it can achieve, what its focus should be. And Jeff's research has been documenting some of these very, very interesting and sometimes quite complex debates.
Of course, people doing research now in this field, some of them you know very well because they're now in the PhD program at the Guildhall School in London. People have very different methodologies and entries and ways of developing their research. But we can say that Jeff Baker's very critical way of approaching with interest his curiosity, but with his critical curiosity has had an influence not only on us looking at these realities, but on many other people.
I think so. And there is a dilemma here. I mean, there are many ways of doing research, as you have said. It's very difficult to be completely critical about a project which is your own creation, your own musical project, your own social musical project, because of course, you want it to be a success, and also very often you have to present the best face in order to get the funding for the project. In some ways, it's easier to do research when you are not a practitioner, or you are not a practitioner of that specific project, but are looking in from the outside as a critical friend. And that was the stance that Jeff Baker was able to take. He is not himself a SIMM practitioner. He is an ethnomusicologist who studies SIMM projects from the outside. And I think that's a dilemma that this field faces. Because quite frankly, the motivation to research this area comes mainly from practitioners, mainly from people who are actually doing SIMM projects and are asking themselves the questions, hopefully, am I doing this project as well as it could be? Am I really achieving the social ends I want to achieve? And how could I study the processes I'm involved in order to make them better? And that is one of the most difficult balancing acts to actually undertake, and to keep very, very distinct your role as a practitioner and your role as a researcher. And I think that the SIMM platform maybe is part of a discussion about how to best be in that mixed position of a practitioner and at the same time a researcher.
Thank you, John. As you could already hear during this episode of the podcast, we start next week on the 12th of January the 5th International Symposium. It was planned to take place on the 18th and 19th of December last year at the Brussels-based Center for the Arts Beaux-Arts, but because of the COVID-19 pandemic, it was reformatted as a series of 9 weekly sessions on Tuesdays from next week, the 12th of January, until the 9th of March. And apart from the first one next week, which will present the keynote speech of Jeff Baker, each live session will first start with presentations of research in this field, then propose a panel discussion with the presenters of the research, and followed by a Q&A with the audience attending the session online. Taking into account the continents from which presenters and attendees connect, most sessions will take place at 4 p.m. Central European Time and some also at 10 a.m. Central European Time. Registration is free. Zoom links are provided on the website of the Arts Center Beaux-Arts. Sound engineer and co-editor of this episode of the SIMM-podcast is musician Mariusz Radwanski. Please visit our website at simm-platform.eu. I'm Lucas Perron. Until next time, bye!